for the presence of God, who has given us favors and graces so that we can all gather on this sunny day, both in person and at home through virtual Zoom meeting. Now, we will moving forward to our main session for today, book launching and discussion session, which will be guided by Sri Lestari Wahyuningrum PhD as moderator for today. To Ma'am Ayu, we invited you to come forward to lead our discussion for today.
Okay, very good morning everyone. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi, salam sejahtera. Greetings to everyone. I'm so happy we're here in a special event. With us now, Professor Olle is here himself. And then we have our honored guest also to speaks at this interesting events discussing Professor Olle Tornquist's books, the trilogy of his books. And we have here Professor Maria Ella Atienza from University of Philippines, Diliman. Welcome, Ella. And thank you for accepting our invitations and coming here. And we this is a new encounter for us for such an event, but we're hoping that we can do more often things like this and to involve you as well. And then we also have here as our speaker, Dr. Lukijani. Dr. Lukijani, thank you also for being here, but also to help to support us, to assist us with the whole visiting professor that we are inviting Professor Tornquist as the visiting professor to our university. And this event is part of his visit. And for that, we are so grateful for the visit. And then, yeah, so I think we shall just start because we're running quite late, and we apologize for that. It's more on the technical issues, but I think we can commence now. Also, welcome for participants here. There are, so we have this meeting in hybrid ways, so online and offline. So there are some participants here with us in the room. This is an auditorium room in Faculty of Social and Political Science, Universitas Pembangunan Nasional Veteran Jakarta. Of course, we are still cautious with the COVID-19 things, so we have the protocols, health protocols also in place here. So not many people. And we expect not many people coming, but also we have invitations and participants joining from our Zoom Zoom meeting. Welcome everyone, also in the online participants. So it's really great that we all are here to discuss the book that recently published by Professor Tornquist, in search of social democracy. And with that, I think we shall start with Prof. Tornquist himself to present the book and tell us more about the book. What is it about the book, and what can we reflect from our own context? And for this event, we take Philippines and Indonesia because these two countries are also part of your research in the books as well. So we would like to learn from you directly on the book. The presentations will be in English, although I understand there are a lot of Indonesian students are here as well. But please, if you have comments, you can chat it first, but also later in the question and answer session, you can also comments or questions in Bahasa. So Bahasa in English is okay. I can understand both, but other language I might not understand. So I'm hoping, yeah. All right. So Prof. Olle Tornquist, your stage is here. Can I just read shortly your short bio? I have here, yeah, just to introduce you to our audience. So Professor Olle Tornquist is a global historian and social scientist of Scandinavian roots, born, living, and now also working in the northwestern Swedish archipelago. He was educated at the University of Gothenburg and Uppsala, and has been professor of political science and development research at the University of Oslo since 1997. His focus for the last half a century has been the rise and decline of the second anti-colonial and third liberal and civic waves of democracy, along with efforts at rights-based development. So the floor, the screen is yours.
I have one. Thank you. Thank you so much for, inviting me, and I feel very much brought back to life coming here. It is it's almost moving, actually, because I've been away for so long during the pandemic and missed a lot of my good friends in Indonesia and elsewhere, in Kerala, in India, in the Philippines, and here. So it's a very good reunion, and I feel very much stimulated by it. I'm looking forward to our conversations. Yes, thank you. Can we immediately move to the to the next slide, please? Well, when I was working with pro-democracy activists in Indonesia for many years, after some time I felt we had concluded most of the work, so I thought I should go back and try to summarize my own conclusions from that work and my own work as well. And that was around maybe 10 years ago or something. I was about to retire anyway, and in the welfare state of Sweden, you are forced to retire. You can't just hang on. So, I did it was rather easy to do two things. Can we move to the next slide, please? It was rather easy to do two things. The first was to assess the dynamics of democratization, to summarize lessons from this work, primarily in Indonesia. That was fairly easy to do, actually. The second thing was to sum up, try to insights gained along with colleagues in comparing Scandinavian insights and Indian insights in efforts at social democracy. That was a real challenge, because these contexts are, of course, very different, although there are similar aims and to a certain extent similar means. But it was productive, and we managed in the end to produce a tightly edited anthology of that kind. By the way, thanks to Maria's presence here in the discussion, I will also, bringing in the Philippine experience, I will also be able to bring in a little bit about the Indian experience. But then I wanted to also summarize my experiences, my insights, the conclusions from studying efforts at social democracy more broadly in these three contexts and in comparison with Scandinavia. And that was really really a challenge. So because I tried to bring together conclusions and made some collected works thing, but that was very boring. I tried to write it more theoretically, but it turned unreadable, boring, and filled up with footnotes and everything. So in the end, I ended up with that book, which you see with the students and other activists in, I think, 1999 in Jakarta. And to write that book, I made 4 decisions. Next slide, please. The first thing was it was necessary to try to have some kind of definition of what do we understand with social democracy, if we want to compare it. So I abstained from sort of relying on what movements and groups call themselves. They might call themselves, you know, social democratic, democratic socialists, reform-oriented communists, or something like that. It doesn't matter. We'll have to have some kind of an analytical understanding of what these people are doing. And so I went back to the classical definition of, I think, what we understand with social democratic development. And I think one can summarize that in terms of needs-driven development based on social justice by democratic means. I mean, needs-driven and based on social justice, not based on the people with a huge amount of capital making investment. It's based on the idea of social justice. But this is not a doctrine. It's not like Maoism or Leninism or anything like that. So I think it needs to be specified with an historical approach. And if you go back and find out what has really been done over the years, I think we arrive, and this work, arriving at this, was made together with the colleagues that wrote this book about Scandinavia, India, actually. So it's not just my invention. I can put the blame on many others. So I think one can summarize it in terms of 4 cornerstones, 5 strategies, and 3 generations. And the cornerstones, if you think like a house, 4 cornerstones, the first would be broad interest-based collectivities, you know, like trade unions, farmers' movement, women's organizations, and that sort of thing. It's based on their interests, and they are broad. The second is, of course, democracy, but it's not just electoral democracy. It's generally democratic links between state and society, and the society must consist of equal citizens with equal rights and capacities. That's the means. Those 2 are the means. The third, which is more the aims, an aim is social rights and welfare reforms, and social growth pacts, meaning kind of institutionalization of class struggle in the framework of production and economic life. You don't just fight each other, you can also negotiate. And in a negotiation on economic development, you reach pacts on growth. There are 5 political strategies to get there. The first is to get into the state and dismantle capitalism from above. I mean, it's like, you know, you introduce public health instead of private health. You introduce public transportation instead of private transportation, and that sort of thing. The second is to tame capitalism by rules and regulations. You regulate it. You can't do everything. You can't just go for profit all the time. You need to take care of this and that. The third is to resist capitalism from above, from outside the state, like trade unions, action groups, and so on. The fourth is to escape it by social actions, alternative lifestyles, building cooperatives, and that sort of thing. The fourth is very interesting and important and often neglected, and we will return to it, is kind of series of transformative reforms. And I used to give an example of that by referring to what is in derogative terms in Scandinavia called state feminism. That is when women activists have not just fought their men directly or something, but claimed public reforms often through the state to facilitate their rights. Of course, the right to vote, the right access to the working life, regulated work hours for the domestic workers, stepwise advancing these possibilities, building kindergartens, and so on and so forth. And for each step, the bargaining power of the women and their allies among men has increased. So the reforms are designed to increase their bargaining power as well. And meanwhile, the society changes. And by now, I think one of the success stories in the Scandinavian context is reasonable gender equality, which has been very important, not just for women. It has also promoted production because more women out in working life. It has promoted education. It has promoted the rights of children. It has hopefully made men better human beings as well. So that kind of strategies. This has gone on during 3 generations. We had the Northern Industrial Revolution, the growth of the democratic nation states and so on from the early 20th century and onwards in the North primarily. You had the anti-fascist and anti-colonial second wave of democracy. And you had the third wave of democracy that came parallel with the shrinking importance of statist imperialism and more of the globalized market-driven imperialism. And now we see the petering out of that wave. Okay, so with that perspective, next slide, please. We can, I have to find my own manuscript here. We'll end up with a box like that. It's, you know, it's 3 dimensions, 20 combinations during 3 generations. And of course, I didn't try to fill in all the boxes there, but political scientists and sociologists and others they are obsessed with these kinds of figures and they make some kind of sense. So, but look upon it as a kind of prism through which, you know, you read the historical processes and keep various dimensions in mind. So using these dimensions, I have sort of returned to previous results, and of course results reached together with colleagues and some updates as well, and read them from the point of view of this prism and some current issues with regard to social democratic development. And thus, I must say, I hope that I've generated some new knowledge, not just reproducing old stuff. Next, please. So the second decision was about the comparison. And of course, you can't make experimental comparisons between these contexts. They are so different. You can't say, you know, most similar, most different approach or comparison. But I've drawn on the idea of making contrasting contexts. What is that about? Well, one example would be when Ben Anderson was expelled from Indonesia. You know, I hope the younger people in the audience also have an idea of who Ben Anderson was. But, you know, he's often presented as an Indonesianist, but he was not just an Indonesianist. He was a comparative analyst, historian, historically oriented. And he always said that his fantastic book about nationalism, you know, this idea about imagined communities and so on, was thanks to the fact that, partly thanks to the fact that he was expelled from Indonesia and was sitting in Thailand and began to ask questions about Indonesia from the point of view of Thailand. So that is the idea of contrasting context. You focus on one theme and you ask questions from one context to the other. And I included also Sweden, of course, to have a case in the north, and I made some references to South Africa and Brazil by working together with colleagues. But to write a book is difficult, and to write it in a way which is not sort of, you know, getting huge. I had to make some additional choices, and the third choice was to formulate the research questions as a kind of, almost like a kind of murder mystery, a criminal stories. So I imagine myself as a Chief Inspector Morse, if you are familiar with that series, British series. He was a fantastic detective, in Oxford, and he was sitting there in his sofa, and he had a murder case, and I imagined the same thing. I'm sitting here in the sofa in my study, and I'm formulating my research questions as murder mysteries. And then I use only those aspects of that prism you saw earlier to solve the specific historical cases, the historical puzzles. And in order also to the final decision to reduce the length and improve readability, I was also trying to imagine that I was perhaps to a certain extent would have liked to write a script for a film rather than, you know, just a novel or a research report. So you can find, by going back to interviews, field notes, and photographs, I tried to bring alive conclusions and some of the experiences. So this is how the book was produced. Let's now turn to the final next page slide, please. Let's now turn to the conclusions. The first conclusion, which is very obvious, very clear cut, I think, having a look back to the experiences, is that the crisis of social democracy is global. And I give you, one case from my own country, because the crisis for social democracy in Sweden is deemed to be a kind of paradigmatic case of social democratic development in the North. It began, I would say, in the early 1970s, and it's related quite a lot to international factors. It's related first to the deregulation of the international economic system. That was regulated after the Second World War, and the decision was taken in a little place in North America called Bretton Woods. And that was scrapped by President Nixon. And why did he scrap it? Because he wanted to finance his war in Vietnam by increasing the value of the dollar. So that affected the global international cooperation that had been introduced after the Second World War, made things difficult including for Sweden, the Swedish social democracy. The second thing was the oil crisis, when the OPEC increased the prices of the oil very, very sharply. The effect of that wouldn't have been so serious if the oil sheikhs had used the money to buy products from places like Sweden. But they didn't do that. They used the money in the financial markets and sent them to Switzerland and other places. So it meant, problems for the nationally confined Keynesian policy that had been pursued in countries like Sweden since the 1930s. There was also the authoritarian low-wage industrialization in East Asia that affected places like Scandinavia. The picture there you see is the closing down of the shipyard in my own hometown in the west coast of Sweden. We had to close down the entire shipyard. That affected some people quite badly. Some people benefited from it, but others were affected quite badly. And over the years, when the Social Democrats couldn't really help them very much, then they began to vote on neo-nationalist populist parties instead. There were people at the time, like Willy Brandt and Olof Palme, who tried to counter this by trying to internationalize Keynesianism, demand-based policies, by way of ideas about a North-South partnership, a new economic world order. But they were not just confronted by the power of the international capital, they were also confronted with the fact that the partners, their like-minded friends in the South, had been weakened. So they failed. And that's when the field was wide open for Maggie Thatcher and Ronald Reagan with their neoliberal, the neoliberal policies that they pursued. So it's global. For Sweden, countries like Sweden are affected by very much what happened and didn't happen in the Philippines or here and some other places. And in the South, of course, it was affected by this as well. plus thereafter the Social Democrats' adjustment in the North to the global neoliberal regimes and their support for elitist rather than social democratic oriented democratization in the South. So these things are linked up with each other. Please, next page or slide. So the first mystery to solve is why the initially impressive anti-colonial movement partners in the South were weakened and unable to support partnership with the North. In this case, we will get Philippines much more later on, but in this case, I think it's very instructive to compare the two most successful cases at the time, and that is Kerala in the southwest part of India and Indonesia. Because, you know, at that time, the left in the reformist communists in Indonesia and their partners in Kerala had both been very successful. They had advanced in elections. So in Kerala, for instance, the first reformist communist-led government in the world in free elections. The first time they were elected in free elections were in Kerala in 1957. They could form government in the state of Kerala in 57. In Indonesia at the time, the left won local elections in many parts of Indonesia in 57. So these were good times. They were advances. Next slide, please. But in the end of the 50s, there were changes in the, and particularly in Indonesia. So the successful democratization was downgraded in favor of priorities given to anti-imperial, anti-feudal left populism, signified by support for President Sukarno's and his army supporters, his generals, for guided democracy. And in the Philippines, the left, their post-war focus was always on anti-imperial policies against the United States because democracy was seen and in reality was very much limited by the US dominance. So that had to, the conviction, the idea was we have to get rid of that before we can really bet on democracy. Now, in addition to that, West-oriented socialists in Indonesia and liberals abandoned democracy too. They also abandoned democracy. And they were betting, particularly in Indonesia, betting on the military. And in the Philippines, they were vacillating and did quite funny things as well. And they were supporting the idea, modernization idea, supported by the Professor Samuel Huntington, who said, we need politics of order. Democracy is not yet, it's premature. We had to have solid state institutions, and to build these solid state institutions, we need support of the army. Later on, perhaps we can have some kind of democracy. Next page, please. So without emphasis on democratization at the time, it was very difficult to fight the political and often statist pathways to capitalism at the time. You can't really do that because these people were capturing the state and the public resources, right? That happened in the Philippines as well. But without getting in there, without trying to gain democratic control of these resources, it was difficult to fight them. In Indonesia, it led to the genocide and Suharto's new order. In the Philippines, we had Marcos. Kerala, however, meanwhile, in India, stood tall. They didn't give up on democracy. They used democracy and improved it, and they did better. But in Indonesia and in the Philippines and the global South in general at the time, and during the 60s and much of the 70s, 2 decades, there was West and East supported authoritarianism. Moscow at the time had their own ideas about statist development, which they supported. They called it non-capitalist development. Doesn't matter, but it was quite similar. Now, so during that period of time, from the left to the right, they all negated democracy That is the problem we are still living with, particularly in Indonesia. Next, please. Then there were new hopes, you know, with the rise of the third wave of democracy. I just want you to remember how it emerged. Look at the left, the woman who places the flower. That was in the streets of Lisbon in Portugal when they did away with the fascist regime. Second one is from just a year or something later when the junta, the military clique in Greece lost their power. And the name of Mikis Theodorakis, the wonderful musician, is mentioned there in the banner. Then it spread to Manila. You see the picture from the Edsa Avenue where people blocked the possibilities for the army to get in and disrupt it. This was emphasized later on. Of course, it affected Latin America as well. Then we turned to Europe, where the wave got higher with the fall of the wall in Berlin. In Prague, even a poet is gaining power. You see Václav Havel looking out from the balcony. And in South Africa, Nelson Mandela comes out of prison, they gain power, they win elections, and you do away with Suharto in Indonesia. But that wave turned inconvincing and is now regressing. In Russia, it's even turned into imperial Bonapartism and war imperialism. Next, please. So what are the conclusions that come out from the book and the comparison with regard to the problems during the third wave of democracy? Well, it is in the context of neoliberal ideas and economies, and the adjustment of social democrats to that process. The first thing we have to remember is that the democratization, the democratic wave, was not backed up by social democratic industrial and welfare policies as it was in the context of the global north after the Second World War. Then at that point, the US even supported this by way of the Marshall Aid, and there were other regulations, you know, fostering the growth of the welfare, social democratic oriented welfare state and inclusive development and so on. This didn't happen in the global south. We have scattered and weak working classes, therefore. And those social growth compromises are not feasible because you don't have strong enough partners, unions and employers' organizations to negotiate them. So the general conclusion, class-based social democracy organized. Only class-based social democracy is not enough. And it's very clear. It holds true even in places where trade unions are stronger, like in South Africa and Brazil. The second thing is, of course, that we, realizing this, many of us said we need broader alliances. We need to build, you know, movements among informal labor, among farmers, among fisher folks, indigenous peoples, organizations, and so on and so forth. And this bottom-up efforts are, of course, fine. And civil society organizations, but they have proved, sorry to say, it's really depressing anyway. It's not been possible to bring these groups together on the basis of their own priorities and organizations. They remain constantly very fragmented. It's not because these people are stupid or anything, or not well-intended. It's because their priorities don't converge, and because the people they try to bring together are fragmented and not really reaching out to the wider constituencies. So bottom up is fine, but not enough. So we were hoping then that the liberal-oriented democratization would bring us together and be a framework for joint work. But that process has accommodated powerful elites by allowing them to retain private assets and privatize the public resources they were controlling, and they were also able to negotiate the new rules of the game so that it was so difficult for genuine pro-democrats to get in and build political alternatives. In Indonesia, you don't even have a, progressive party inside the parliament. It's remarkable, right? So democratization, it has been shallow and also not enough. In the north, meanwhile, in the case of Sweden, which is my case then, there was an attempt really in 2014, after many difficult years of adjustment, to restart by way of internationalization. But that failed again without international partners, broad international alliances. So, when the North had neglected alliances and support for the Arab Spring people, the people who were bravely going out in the streets and so on and so forth, and trying to change their regimes and their countries, when they were not supported and protected, like in the most horrible case in Syria, right? Then these people had to flee. And they had to go around in Europe and try to find some safe place. And they even got up to Sweden. And after some time, the right-wing oriented neo-nationalists gained support from the population, saying, no, you can't come here anymore. We are have to close the borders. And social democrats got very worried and turned 180 degrees and more or less linked up with that tendency as well. So now they're inward-oriented, quite sort of neglecting many of the international issues, except, of course, the threat from the Russians. Next, please. So the third then is it all impossible? Is social democratic development impossible in the South? Well, if you examine all these problems that I tried to do, you also see that there are openings. Things could be done, been done slightly different. There are openings. Some things have been successful. I'd like to take two cases. One is from Indonesia. I think it's, it has proved possible to bring together scattered working class organizations, civil society organizations, and so on, in broad alliances behind alternative policy proposals, welfare proposals, combined with demands for more democracy. One such case, the most powerful, I guess, was the Broad Front in 2010-11. The Broad Alliance brought together behind the welfare, the claims for welfare, social security reforms in Indonesia, which led to the BPJS, right? Another example, more current example, is in Kerala, where the struggle against the COVID-19 was carried out not just by way of giving people vaccination and so on, and forcing them to stay indoors and closing down the society now and then. It was also very much done by welfare reforms that allowed poor people to do that. You can't sit in quarantine without getting some income, some livelihood. So you have to organize support for them, which was done in combination by democratic local governments and civil society organizations like the women you see in the picture, the Kerala's Kundrabasi, the women's cooperatives that provided food for people who had to stay at home or had lost their jobs and so on. They were not left in the streets as in North India or dying outside the hospitals. They were given support. And that kind of welfare reforms locally, combination of local governments and civil society, and on the state level by way of broader reforms that united people and led to a fantastic left victory in the local elections and in the state elections. This kind of broad unity that can be built in that way may also pave the way for possibilities of negotiating growth pacts. So in that sense, you sequence the social democratic experiences from the north, you put broad alliances for welfare reforms combined with democracy, you put that ahead of the growth pacts rather than a little bit the other way around, which was the practice in the north. Finally, final page. There are two main problems with these experiences, with these openings. The first is the lack of a series of transformative reforms. So, like in Indonesia, when you had the broad lines for the social security reform, right? It was successful, and when the victory was won, people celebrated it, but then went back to their individual scattered activities. So the unions returned to their rather narrow priorities, and civil society organizations returned to their very narrow priorities. And the progressive politicians had formed part of the coalition. They returned to their very inward-oriented parties. So, you know, there wasn't any continuation. The second thing was that there wasn't any way of negotiating, you know, broader reforms, continuation. So as you see in that picture down to the right, you know, people were quarreling about it. This is from a meeting in Jakarta in, I think, 2013 or something, where Syed Iqbal and Surya Chandra and others are sitting discussing, shouldn't we continue to have a wider, a broader alliance and new reforms and that sort of thing. And Surya and Syed Iqbal was one of those who said there isn't any viable way of negotiating that. We can't negotiate. There isn't any way of doing it. So for him, it was natural to rather link up to horse trade with individual politicians, even with Prabowo. And for others, went to their politicians, and then it was all divided. So that is really a problem. There must be some kind of democratic partnership, governance, and framework for negotiations that is viable. So that's the conclusion. And just final slide for those who would like to take a note on a discount code you can use if you like to buy the book as an ebook, a 35% discount. Take down that code and close the slide. Thank you so much.
That's good to know, the discount part. But thank you so much, Professor Tornquist, for the sharing. I think this is a piece of work, and I'm certain that this is a reflection, a long reflection of your works, your research, extensive research in and really portraying what happened now, the situation in the North and South. I can see here Pak Agus Wijoyo is here with us. Hello, Pak Agus. Yeah, he's in Manila, I think. Our ambassador, Indonesian ambassador. Hello, Pak Agus. It's really good to see you here. All right. So I will.
Yes. Good morning, Mbak Ayu.
Yeah. Ya, sehat-sehat selalu, Pak. Yeah. I'll go next to Professor Maria Ella Atienza, or Ella. Let me just shortly introduce you, Ella, to the audience here. Wait a second. Yeah, okay. So Professor Maria Ella Atienza is professor and former chair of the Department of Political Science, University of the Philippines, Diliman. She is the editor of the Philippine Social Science Journal, the Scopus Journal of the Philippine Political Science Association, and co-convener of the program on social and political change of the UP Center for Integrative and Development Studies. She also served as director of the UP Third World Studies Center and president of the Philippine Political Science Associations until 2009. So Ella, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Ayu. Good morning to everyone, Ambassador, former, and Professor Tornquist, and all academics, students, and everyone. I'm grateful to the Faculty of Social and Political Science of the Universitas Pembangunan Nasional Veterans Jakarta for the invitation to be a reactor to the book launch of Professor Tornquist. And I think one positive thing about the pandemic is that I think I have more engagement with fellow Southeast Asian scholars during the pandemic than before, because webinars have been our way of connecting with one another. So it's good that I hope we can sustain this even after the pandemic. And of course, it's an honor to actually join this book launch of Professor Tornquist. I think the last time we met was in Eurosys in Berlin in 2019. I was with Tessa Tadem, and in 2018, you visited the Philippines. You gave a lecture at the UP Center for Integrative and Development Studies on Indonesian politics. So it's good that the book is already out, and I also would like to highlight that Professor Tornquist can be included in the group of select comparativist scholars that can really claim that they know the context and history of the Philippines, and they can really talk about Philippine politics because they have really conducted a lot of grounded research. They kept their networks and engagements with people and movements in the Philippines, and it's a continuous partnership. It's very difficult to find scholars that can claim that they can talk about countries in Southeast Asia, including the Philippines. And I'm glad that Professor Tornquist produced this book, which is also a reflection of his, if I'm correct, half a century of engaging in the region. So it also came out at an interesting time in the Philippines, and I hope in my comments I can also use some of your conclusions to actually reflect on the current developments in the Philippines. So here are some of my major comments or initial comments on the book of Professor Tornquist. First one, the puzzle which you framed in a very interesting, very reader-friendly manner is very relevant, not only from a Philippine perspective, but from a comparative one. And I like how you frame the questions that there are lessons that can be learned from the experience of the South, which can also be instructive for the North and for the global prospects for social democracy. And second, as a qualitative researcher, while I, of course, enjoy looking at the work of our colleagues doing quantitative research, explaining things using large N cases in looking at the prospects of democracy in Southeast Asia and globally, I like the grounded comparative historical perspective that Professor Tornquist actually forwarded in the book. And at the same time, it was also able to provide a very comprehensive presentation of the major questions, and I'm glad that you discussed the definitions of social democracy, the relevant theories, and you also presented a very rich array of empirical evidence in the countries that you studied. And of course, the most important contributions would be the four cornerstones of social democracy and whether they are present or lacking in the cases that you studied. So in particular, and this is the third part of my my discussion, in the Philippine case, definitely the book was able to cover the experiments of the Philippine left until the early 2000s, and at the same time also when particularly Akbayan entered into a coalition with the Liberal Party, and it was part of the ruling coalition from 2010 to 2016. And of course, in 2016, Akbayan was able to put in the Senate Risa Hontiveros, but at the same time, 2016 was the beginning of what some other scholars call an illiberal turn in Philippine politics with the election of Duterte. The problem, of course, is that social democratic forces in the Philippines failed to really present an alternative to the oligarchy, while the 1987 Constitution established a lot of democratic openings for many sectors and progressive groups to participate in elections because of the weakness of the electoral system and the political parties, as well as the strength of traditional politicians. Even the small portion of the party list system has also been hijacked by a lot of traditional politicians and also allies of the president, particularly President Duterte. This was also the result of a study that we conducted at the UP Center for Integrative and Development Studies, supported by the International IDEA, the Institute for Democracy and Electoral Accountability, where even if the Constitution establishes checks and balances and the co-equal branches of government, there is definitely executive dominance, and this was highlighted particularly since 2016. The traditional security sector, particularly the armed forces of the Philippines and the Philippine National Police, have been strengthened and promoted to prominence, particularly since 2016. And many of these problems with Philippine democracy have been sustained and exposed more prominently since 2020 with the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, we also noted that there were also cases of positive openings for more democratization. Of course, there are some exemplary and progressive local government units that have actually used many of the democratic openings of the 1991 decentralization law in the Philippines, but they are very few, and there really are problems if we focus only on bottom-up initiatives, as Professor Tornquist mentioned. The problem is how do we scale up all these good practices. But at the same time, also COVID-19 has also provided openings for sectors that were not initially very vocal about the state of the economy and the state of public services in the Philippines. The problematic response of the national government to the pandemic has resulted in the rise of what we call community pantries, which were sprouting in different parts of the Philippines to address the problem of food insecurity. Suddenly, issues that were relevant before, but only progressive sectors were mentioning, became very important issues like the problem of the agricultural sector, labor groups, and women's groups have been highlighted as a result of the pandemic. And in a way, this may pave the way to what is currently unfolding in the Philippines. And I don't know if that will later be subsumed to what Professor Tornquist mentioned as the broad alliances and visible openings that may reinvigorate progressive movements, because we now, since the pandemic and now leading to the May 2022 elections, we have an unprecedented coalition of different groups in the Philippines supporting the current vice president in her bid to be the president. Of course, based on surveys, the front runner is still the son of the former dictator, but looking at the groups that are now endorsing the vice president, for the first time, we have Akbayan and the Makabayan coalition, two sectors of the Philippine left that are often at odds with each other since 1986, coming together and supporting one candidate. We have youth groups, doctors groups, medical professionals coming together, and even church groups that are mobilizing in ways that are quite similar to what was happening in 1986, leading up to the snap elections and the EDSA people power. So we're not sure if this can be mobilized and can gain momentum and be successful during the elections. But what we are, from our perspective, from some of us that are watching the events in the Philippines leading up to the elections, we're actually reflecting on possibilities of what can this current alliance or coalition can do even beyond the elections, whether they win or they lose in terms of the presidency. And I think in this case, it may be relevant to go back to one of the conclusions of Professor Tornquist, the possible resequencing of social democracy with rights and welfare reforms that might be the precursor to social growth paths rather than the other way around. Because what mobilized people to support the current campaign of the vice president is the lack of rights, the unequal treatment of various sectors, not only since the pandemic, but since the Duterte administration and even earlier. It's also interesting that there's a labor leader also running for the presidency. It's not, of course, the prospects are not very high for him, but for the first time, we have a labor leader running for a national public position. And in that case, that also transformed the presidential debates among the candidates. We are now also talking about taxing the rich, taxing business groups, taxing the higher income groups. So will the left finally get it right these elections? That is our question nowadays. Is it now the time that the left movements will prioritize democracy? Is it possible to negotiate with the elites and the traditional politicians? Some of them are now part of the broadening alliance behind the vice president. Is it possible to institutionalize reforms like reforming the electoral system, focus on building strong political parties, and focusing on social welfare and inclusive economic growth? Will this pave way for more sustained movements towards more inclusive democracy. So in conclusion, I would like to thank Professor Tornquist for the very important puzzles that you presented in your book. And I hope that this will not be your end book, as you mentioned in your introduction. And perhaps we can reflect on many things happening in the Philippines, in Indonesia, and many other countries as we see more mobilizations and more movements unfolding for social democracy, not only in this part of the world, but in other parts of the world. Thank you very much. Maraming salamat. Terima kasih.
Thank you, Ella. Certainly, we still have a long way to go, so this won't be the last book. As we go our way is still a long way to go. Thank you so much. I think it was a very rich insights from you, Ella, from the Philippine situation, and I assume now it's a busy days for you guys in Philippines, and I thank you for sparing your time to join us here. All right, I am going to pass the next talk to Dr. Lucky Jani. Dr. Lucky Jani is one of our lecturer here in Political Science Department, Universitas Pembangunan Nasional Veteran Jakarta. He is currently, other than teaching at the university, he is also the secretary to member of Presidential Advisory Council. He graduated his PhD from the Asia Research Center, Murdoch University, Australia, on a thesis on anti-corruption movement and local politics in Indonesia. And he's well known in Indonesian as one of the experts, the best experts on the anti-corruption, the good governance, and democracy. So his areas of interest has been democratization, governance, anti-corruption, public sector reform, social movement, decentralization, and local politics, citizen participation, election, and welfare policy. So, Pak Lucky, the stage, or you take the stage, or yeah, I better take the stage. Yeah.
Oh yes. Yeah. I'm not fast.
Oke, selamat pagi. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera bagi kita semua. Good morning to you, Professor Tornquist. Selamat pagi, Pak Duta Besar Indonesia di Manila. Magandang umaga, Professor. It has been interesting weeks for us having Professor Tornquist in our campus here in Jakarta. And prior to visit to UPN, Professor Olle also visited another campuses in Jogja and in Malang. Also to disseminate, or what we call it in Bahasa is sosialisasi his newly book. So I'm going to start with this presentation to reflect on what we have been doing together, me and Professor Tornquist, in the recent years, that we did some research along with the friends in UGM, and we come up with this terminology, the broader alliance. At the time back in 2017, we were very optimistic that there are openings particularly in Indonesian politics because of the President Jokowi geared toward more reform-oriented administration, and we see that as an opportunity. But then a week ago, when we have a friendly discussion over a cup of coffee, I mentioned to Professor Tornquist in mid-2000s, I mean, in mid-2000, Professor Tornquist has two very popular terms for Indonesian politics. One is the so-called floating democrats, kaum demokrat mengambang, and the other is democracy is hijacked, demokrasi dibajak. And I was jokingly say to Professor Tornquist that the situation is still the same now. At least the Democrats are still floating, not sinking. That's good news. There is still hope there because of the Democrats are still floating. So they are somewhere out there. Okay. Next slide, please. I would like to start in the recent development, particularly in Indonesia. In Indonesia, we consider ourselves still in transitional mode, even though there has been over 20 years passed since the Reformasi movement in 1998, but we see ourselves still situated under the transitional mode. I'm not sure whether in the Philippines, friends there consider themselves still under the transition. Maybe not, because it's almost over 40 years from the EDSA revolution. But here in Indonesia, we think that we are still struggling in a democratic transition to achieve a democratic government. And we can see that the consolidation to democracy depends also on how we manage the economic structure. So the democratization in Indonesia also depends not only on the economic performance, but also depend on how the public resources being distributed fairly to several entities, including social and political groups. And this is important because we have seen in the past 20 years in Indonesia, public resources being allocated based on demand from the emerging social groups or political groups that enters the political arena after the New Order regime. And because these groups has limited economic resources, has limited economic base, so they are very much depend on the public resources, on the national budget. So this is one of the problems that might hinder the democratization process in Indonesia. And on the other hand, the campaign to push forward the neoliberal reform agenda also deepening in Indonesia. Many economists think that the market is a superior entity or superior arena to regulate the social interaction as well as economic organization. So more and more programs geared towards the more neoliberal agenda. And the third challenges faced by us here in Indonesia is that the fragmentation and the polarization of politics become widened. We can see, at least in the past 10 years, probably since the 2012, the Jakarta gubernatorial election, and then 2014 election, 2017, again, Jakarta gubernatorial election, and the last 2019 presidential election. The polarization become wider. No? And the polarization not only because the political ideology, but also because the increase of the identity politics emerged in Indonesian political arena. No? This is not only a populist structure or populist campaign, but populism combined with the identity politics. My colleagues, Fedi Hadis, term it as the right-wing populism. You know? So these are the obstacles that we face here in Indonesia. But, next slide, please. But interestingly, if we look at the development of the welfare scheme in Indonesia, especially programs introduced after the Orde Baru regime falls, you can see so many programs or so many welfare schemes introduced by various government. Since Gus Dur, Megawati, SBY, and under current administration, see, it become very expansive. Yeah. Our research, myself and Willie here, we discover that the Indonesian welfare programs or welfare schemes have so many variations. I use Jeremy Sicking's typology of describing the welfare system. So we have all from the workerish, the agrarian types, the pauperish, and the productive. And these are programs that introduced by a government, not necessarily because of the demand from below. Yes, we can see the BPJS schemes as well as the village funds were formulated because of the strong demand from below. One from labor union for the BPJS, and another one from the village organization for the village fund. But the rest of those programs was introduced mainly on top-down style. So the government introduced those schemes, not necessarily because they are embracing the so-called social democracy paradigm or framework, but because it is the way of thinking that the state should take care of their citizens. So it's not based on solidarity, not based on social justice, but this is based on other framework or other paradigm. And the most recent scheme that is been discussed within the administration is that to introduce so-called the wage subsidy, perhaps similar to what been established in India. I forgot the name, Olle. Can you the rural employment scheme? Yeah, rural employment scheme. Yes, this wage subsidy more or less similar to the rural employment scheme in India, and we also have the partial unemployed benefit programs. So if you look at this lineup of welfare programs or welfare scheme in Indonesia, we have so many programs. In fact, we think that this is too many, but too little. Too little in terms of too many programs, and there is not enough budget to support and consolidate the outcome of these programs. Okay. Next slide, please. So again, there is a constant tension between the neoliberal approach and the progressive approach of welfare reform. We identified that the existing welfare schemes that already in place has been not able to fulfill at least 5 different conditions that emerge due to the entrenchment of a neoliberal market economy, and also because of the pandemic. During the pandemic, our so-called the aspiring middle class become downgrade and move back to the what so-called the masyarakat miskin. What's in English? Lower income or poor family. So that's because of the pandemic. No? But the welfare schemes that I mentioned earlier, we have not been able to meet with other emerging conditions like the industrialization, for example, the informal economy, the flexible labor market, and the uneven economic development. So even though we have extensive programs, extensive schemes, but those schemes have not been able to answer those situations. Another interesting insight that myself and Andrew Rosser discovered when we study on the health-based reform, that the initiative to introduce a reform agenda, in particular in health sector, is very much depend on whether the initiative will threaten the interests of predatory elites or not. And the second is whether the proposal could attract support from popular audience or from the populist elements in the society. That then would determine the outcome of the reform proposal. Other development that interests us is that some politicians are aware, that using this welfare as their campaign promises, using this welfare as their political advancement for their political career is a good case. We can see that several bupatis, wali kota, and governor Indonesia use local health scheme in order to win the election. They understand that by using this welfare agenda, welfare program, could actually advantage for their own political career. So then, given these so many obstacles and challenges, next please. What can we do in the near future? I would not touch upon the broad civil society movement in Indonesia, because in my understanding that the civil society movement in Indonesia is more or less the so-called the social non-movement. It's not a social movement, it's a social non-movement. So then I turn to the campus or in a university-based initiative or movement. Why? Because a university has resources. University has network. University has knowledge, and university has masses. Most of them are students to be mobilized, quote unquote. But then we need to go beyond our routine, teaching and grading, and then start to do more what we call here in Indonesia pengabdian masyarakat. Mbak Ayu, what is pengabdian masyarakat in English? Social services or community services? Yeah. So the university professor, university lecturers, and students need to go to the society, go to the community, and enlighten them their rights, their basic rights, enlighten them in terms of the how they can situate themselves in the new democratization process in Indonesia, and also guide them not to be trapped under the so-called right-wing populism. So rather than involve or being active in politics because of the identity, ethnic, religious, or other identity, but we can then have some formulation with them that we can enter the politics and participate actively in politics by having a so-called the welfare proposal. See, this is what I think can be done in the near future. So campus or university become the backbone of the new initiative, new movement, and we have resources. Campuses or universities have resources, and the only thing we need is that we can sit down together and come up with the genuine proposal and put forward those proposals to other social organizations and to the state institution. So I would like to end my notes here. I'm still optimistic in this sense, especially when I listen closely to your presentation about the openings, about the opportunity. I am confident that there are proposals that we could formulate together and then put forward as a vehicle, as concrete proposal that we could offer to various organizations out there. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Pak Lucky. I think that was a great presentation. I think the last slide in particular was interesting. The initiatives, the campus-based initiatives or movements, and that sounds promising, right? Yeah, but we can discuss more on that and any other points that we can pick up from the three presenters, which all of them shared interesting views and interesting points. So I welcome everyone if you have any comments. So we come to the Q&A session now. I welcome everyone if you have any comments or questions to three speakers of ours here. You can raise hands in the online in the Zoom meeting. You can raise hand, or you can chat right in the chat, or in the offline in the room. If anyone has anything, you can just raise hand and speak. Anyone? Yeah, we have one here from our meeting room. Is there anyone? Two, right? Two. Okay, two people from the meeting room. And is there anyone from the Zoom? Do we still have Pak Agus Wijoyo with us? Perhaps he would like to comment. I think Pak Agus left. All right, okay. For now, we take two questions or comments first. Would like to start? Please give your name and affiliation.
Okay. My name is Bati Nugroho Mataram, and I am from political science student. I have some questions. I want to ask about your opinion about crisis democracy in context of Indonesian. You say before it was a global sectoral problem. So there are some statements in social media that Indonesians were trapped between social democrat and authoritarian that leads to oligarchy. So what are your opinion about that? Thank you.
Passing it to you, the question.
Mr. Tornquist.
Okay, so this is for Professor Tornquist. The next one, please.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Risha Zahra from Political Science Student 2020, Jakarta, and I have a question for Mr. Luki. Talk about the democracy in Philippines and Indonesia. In the Philippines, opposition senator is arrested under Duterte presidency. Senator Trilance has openly criticized Duterte, as did his colleague, San Leila de Lima, a fierce critic who has been detained since February 2017. The country clearly hasn't learned from its own history that strongman leaders rarely create societies in which justice and human rights flourish. And my question is, in your opinion, will Indonesia make the same mistake, since we can see from the real evidence lately that sometimes people's voice are not heard and the media is being silenced? Then they try to control what to post and what we should not post. And I don't think that's how democracy works. Thank you.
Okay, the question was for Pak Luki, but I think it also be interesting if Ella can also give some response to that, because it reflects on the Philippines situation.
Of
All
course.
right, so Ella, did you can you get the question? All right, so perhaps Ella first, and then to Luki. Oh, but maybe first we go to the first question first. Olle, if you can respond.
I am not entirely sure that I got the, but I understood it to be a kind of, trapped between efforts at social democracy on the one hand and the interest of the oligarchs. That's what you are thinking of, right? Okay. So yes, on the way you can say that social democratic efforts are up against the oligarch interest. However, I think in problem related to, I mean, that is nothing new in a way. It's nothing, now it is presented often in Indonesia as if we suddenly have got a number of new oligarchs and a new dominance of these groups, and that we have an authoritarian or slide down of democracy and all that. That's really isn't very new. We've seen this since quite long. It may be recently discovered by certain good friends and colleagues, but it's not very new. Now I think the main problem is the lack of, and I should also add, before I come to the main problem, I should also add, it's nothing unique for Indonesia or anyway. It's of course applies to the Philippines. It very much applies to India as well. Even if Kerala has thanks to its land reform managed to get rid of some of that ancient regime kind of base in rent seeking around big landed properties, but otherwise you'll have the same situation there. And you also have the situation in other parts of the world. Even in Scandinavia, we have this increasing strength of an increasing economic inequality and the strength of business sector and so on. The problem, as I see it, is therefore how you negotiate it, how you make policies to try to identify to what extent can you work together with people who are dominating in the economic sector, to what extent can you reduce their powers and transform the system. Now, because we really can't win on the battlefield, right? We can't bring them out there and shoot them down, kind of. So we'll have to find a way of negotiating and increase sort of the side of ordinary people, their bargaining power, and try to negotiate and try to with the other side on matters that we can agree on. So one thing, for instance, that we could mention from my own context is to reduce the power of the financial sector, because huge elements of what you here call general oligarchs are within the financial sector. It's rather unproductive sectors. It's a kind of modern rent-seeking sectors. They don't really create new jobs. They don't really create new assets. They send their money to Singapore or elsewhere and avoid taxes and whatnot. And they are undermining the capacity of the government to pursue a reasonably productive-oriented economic reforms. So there is a need to identify what sectors, even among the oligarchs, that are productive-oriented, that would like to advance by making by way of production, by increasing production. And you see, these people, to the extent that we find them, but I think there are some there, are interested in certain welfare reforms because they need to improve the productivity of labor, of these threatened middle-class people. They are interested in education, they're interested in skill development, they're interested in decent health schemes. They may not be primarily interested in helping the urban poor or anything, but they don't want, they want, just like Yukovi in Solo once upon a time, they have to handle the question that the urban poor are sitting there in the middle of the square where they like to build a shopping mall. So, so they have to address these issues, and it's better for them to negotiate it than to have huge street demonstrations. So we have to offer a framework for discussing that, and so on. I know you can call that compromising, class conflicts and whatever, but if we have a perspective, where we not just tame the wolf, but breed it into a working dog, then it makes a difference. So I think it's the framework for negotiating that is missing. Then if we have a functioning framework for talking, negotiating, pursuing these reforms that Luki talked about earlier, you know, how to draft them, how to bring them together, how to come up with unifying processes and concepts, then and of course mobilize for it, which is crucial. But then if there is a framework for them, that we have a way of addressing it. So if, to round up, if we have these reforms, kind of reforms that Dr. Jani, I should say, sorry, not just Luki, that Dr. Jani was suggesting, you know, then we need to convince the opponents that some of them are to their benefit. Some of them are not just cost, but investments that they may also gain from. And we need to then also convince the people, the laboring classes, the professionals, and so on and so forth, that they can gain and make advances by supporting such reforms and strengthen their bargaining power so that they stepwise can get even better reforms. I mean, I know it's not a fabulous revolutionary perspective, but I think that has been the only perspective that has occasionally worked. So yeah, that would be my, sorry, quite lengthy answer.
From Bhatti, do you have any comments or response? Did your question? All right, I think it was lengthy, but it's very go to the point of what Bhatti was asking. And I think because I've been interacting with students, and some of them, many of them also involved in the student movements, similar questions were also raised a few times. So yeah, so thank you for that. Next, Ella, would you like to respond?
Yes, thank you, Ayu, and thank you for the student for pointing out the case of Senator Laila de Lima. I'd like to answer that question in terms of the situation of democracy and democracy indicators in the Philippines. While some will say, observers will say that based on numbers, the Philippines is in a better position compared to other Southeast Asian countries in terms of women's representation in government. Philippine society is still misogynistic. It's still macho. Expectations of men and women are still different. Yes, we did have 2 women presidents before, but they were wives, daughters of politicians. So many of the women, successful women candidates who eventually gain government positions are usually part of political families, and they are part of the elite. So in the case of Senator Laila de Lima, she's also a big victim, not only because she is part of the opposition and very vocal against the drug war and the other programs of President Duterte, but she was also the victim of unfairness of the Congress, the 2 houses of Congress where she belongs, failed to protect her, and they even used her relationship with her driver and assistant as a way of linking her to the drug war. And up to now, they have no proof that she's really involved in the drug war. So we can say that macho and authoritarian leaders like Marcos, Estrada, and Duterte have a tendency of targeting women opposition, because even if Senator Trillanes was very vocal. They were not really very successful in putting him in jail. But the attacks on Senator De Lima was really not only more oppressive. She was until now she's in prison, but she's campaigning because she's also running for re-election as senator. But at the same time, the attacks on women politicians in general in the Philippines are sexist. They create fake sex videos for Senator De Lima before they had allegations of extramarital affairs being committed by the vice president. And now, this week, the Bongbong Marcos camp actually produced some videos that are fake, but they attack the daughters of the vice president. So in the Philippines, women politicians are still at a disadvantage because women are being used to attack them, and it's very different when the candidates are male. They are attacked based on their character, based on their track record, but not in terms of their relationships and their sex or their gender. So I think that's one important point in the Philippines, that when we talk about democratization, Philippine society, including ordinary people and to a certain extent, even democratic social movements sometimes fail to treat women equally compared to men. Thank you.
Boleh diulang pertanyaannya yang khusus Indonesia tadi karena saya kurang begitu jelas.
Okay. In your opinion, will Indonesia make the same mistake as Philippines? As we can see from the real evidence lately, that sometimes the people's voice are being silenced, and is being silenced too. They try to control what to post and what should we not post. And I think that's not how democracy works.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Somehow I'm confident that Indonesian politics at the moment would not set back to what we used to know happened under a new order regime. No, take one extreme example. We do not have any or encounter any military unit as capable as Tim Mawar before. No, no activists being kidnapped, tortured, no, and perhaps killed. It was common during New Order that we have the so-called Bakor Tanasda. We have the so-called what we call it, military intelligence unit that traced and hound down activists, political activists and student activists. And then the notorious Tim Mawar. Now the situation is comparatively more safer, free, and we don't have, sorry to mention name, we don't have men such like Murdiono now. No? Please Google Murdiono on YouTube, and you will fascinated by him, listening how he explain government program. It's I'm find myself SpongeBob is more interesting than him. Now the government try to communicate. Yes, it not always in two-way communication. with this. Yes, there are still what do you call it, dominant bloc or dominant political groups that try to bend the government policy. But on the other hand, the new media, the social media, cannot be organized or cannot be what we call it, censored. The Indonesian government do not have equipment or instrument like what the China administration has. No? So they can ban Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, and other things. Here you can still post on various social media platforms and share your opinion there, raise your voice there, or put forward your concern. I think there is an arena here, both in reality and in the social media, that can be used to enhance or to further democratization in Indonesia. I have the opportunity to compare the political arena in terms of public services in 3 countries, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Burma or Myanmar. In the post-authoritarian regime in these 3 countries, there are public arena emerged. No? In Indonesia, there are musrenbang des, no? Komite sekolah, Dewan Kesehatan. No? I think those newly established arena can be used to further and to enhance our democratization, no? our democracy. The problem is that very few of us participate on those arena. Saya mau tanya sama teman-teman mahasiswa, berapa banyak yang pernah partisipasi di forum-forum musrenbang atau terlibat di dalam komite sekolah? Itu adalah forum yang bisa digunakan untuk kita mendorong gagasan perubahan, demokratisasi, pelayanan publik yang lebih baik. I was asking the students that how many of them have been participate in those newly established arena, at school level, at public health, puskesmas level, at the village level. Those are new arena that can be utilized. And you have the opportunity to interact with the so-called ordinary people. And like what Olle mentioned about the experience in Kerala, the activists there use library to interact and to educate ordinary people to understand that they have rights. So we have the arena, but we are not using it. If we could base and build our critical base at the local level, and then we integrate them somehow to the national network, then we can use as a movement base, and we can have an opportunity to negotiate with the politician. I have another remarks on our politician. Our politician in Indonesia is not yet as entrenched and as skillful as a politician in the Philippines. Professor Ella, correct me if I'm wrong, that in the Philippines, the trapos, traditional politician, the political clan has been entrenched in their municipal or in their provinces for generations. No, it is difficult to have a quarrel with them. Some of them have paramilitary units.
Private
armed units, and they could kidnap you or torture you. Here in Indonesia, our politicians do not yet have that kind of sophisticated instrument or muscles. And most of the politicians here in Indonesia, they do not have strong economic base, like in Thailand or like in the Philippines. So they are very much depend on public budget, APBD or APBN. So if we could isolate this public budget and make them somewhat kind of apa namanya fences, then they cannot easily access those public budget and use the public resources to enhance their political agenda. I think we are in a better position compared to the Philippines and Thailand. So again, the question is whether we would like to utilize newly established arena public spheres in order to enhance the democratization in Indonesia. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Luki. I will now open for the second, the last one for the Q&A session. If anyone would like to raise questions or comments here in the room or even in the Zoom meeting. Okay, we have one in Zoom meeting, Mbak Debbie Prabawati. Apa kabar, Mbak? And then, is there anyone here? Anyone else in the Zoom meeting? You can also ask, bisa juga Indonesia ya, nanti bisa saya bantu terjemahkan ke speakers. So, ya, bahasa Indonesia dan bahasa Inggris are welcome. Ada lagi? Alright, so I'll give the opportunity for Mbak Debbie. Silahkan di unmute dan kalau bisa di on screen, Mbak. Ya, terima kasih.
Mbak Ayu. Good morning, Luki and Ella. I would like to comment and give some question to you, to the three of you, and also, I have a question to Surya actually in the previous discussion, but there's no time to for this this question. So regarding with the fragmented and social movement in Indonesia, which is I think it's very challenging time to time in respect of one thing is changing generations. The problem, I think, in my opinion, is not only the gap of fragmentation among sectors or issues, but also it is among the generations. In my opinion, there's a problem between old and young generation in some kind of a transfer of knowledge between the old and young generation. So especially in the digital era and where, the millennial generation and now the nowadays generation is kind of a there's a wide gap between them. So I think there are some gaps, if you're not saying a wide gap between 90s and nowadays generation, where the values and knowledge transformation is not working quite well between them. And since one of the critics for civil society movement activists is the exclusivism, which is creating another elites among activists actually. So I think building a broader alliance is not solely important among sectors and issues, but also among generations. so that the values can be extended, not continued, and continued. But it is also important to build alliance with young generation or intra-generations, especially in this digital era. The challenges, I think, can be advantage or benefit for all. Well, I'm not questioning to Olle about the digital era. I think he's not or boomerang activities. So I think the most another part is that I think the most challenging part in this process is in the education sector, which we still have a big problem. As sorry, Ella, in this case is in Indonesia, which the system is changing anytime the Minister of Education or regime change, and this is one part of education institution homework, I think. And for Ella, I think I have a silly question about, because I'm not quite following the Philippines politics nowadays. And my question is, how about the regeneration of representatives in the Philippines, especially in the political system? Because as long as I know, Risa Hontiveros has been in the same position since early 2000s. And why is it? Is there any new faces, especially for women? And what's actually the challenging situation beside of the macho politics, which is also happened in Indonesia? That's all, Mbak Ayu. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Mbak Debbie. So one for the three speakers and one specific questions for Ella. Well, we don't know, but Debbie, Ole might do some TikTok as well. So, all right. So I give the microphone to Paluki dulu. Yeah. Okay. So Luki and then Ella, and then I go to Ole, and Ella can also respond to the second question. Thank you.
Oke, terima kasih Mbak Debbie untuk pertanyaannya. I would like to just briefly answer your question. Yes, it is important intergenerational dialogue or communication, especially to transfer the ideas and the knowledge what have been built in the past to the current or to the younger generation. That's still perhaps one of aspect that we are not very much aware before, and therefore thank you, Mbak Debbie, to raise this situation. But I've seen the students' movement, especially back in 2019, when the students mobilized themselves, rally against the new KPK law and new KUHP law. And I see that the students have been able to organize themselves using the available technology. And that is one of the advantage that the student actually can utilize. I would like to draw a parallel analogy with what happened in the Philippines. In the EDSA revolution, first they used radio. It's I forget the name of the radio, but it was Veritas radio.
Veritas, yes, it's a religious Catholic radio.
Veritas radio has been widely used by activists in order to spread the information, in order to educate Philippines public, as well as to mobilize a rally against Marcos regime. And during the EDSA second, they use text, SMS, to mobilize against the, I forgot your president.
Estrada.
Arab Estrada,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah, and perhaps at At the moment, they use various social media, WhatsApp, Zoom, Twitter, Instagram, in order to organize, to mobilize themselves, like what happened in Hong Kong. Yeah? Students in Hong Kong very much use technology to resist the Chinese government or China government, mainland China government. No, back in 2017 and 2018, and they have the wonderful umbrella revolution in Hong Kong. So I think the current generation, the younger generation, can be adaptive. They use available means or instrument in order to empower themselves and raise their concern. So the only thing what we need to do is what Mbak Dewi said. How can we have intergenerational this dialogue or discussion so that the ideas of transforming Indonesian politics or the transformative politics can be understood by the younger generation as well. Thank you.
Okay, Ella?
Yeah, thank you, Ayu. Thank you, Debbie, for the questions. Let me address also the first one about the fragmentation and the generational aspect about social movements. Very briefly, before I go to the female representation in government. Of course, in the Philippines, we have new generations coming in. Many of them have no memories of the Marcos dictatorship, and for a time there was a lot of debate about whether younger activists have no memory or they don't care about the legacies of the Marcos dictatorship. But when President Duterte actually allowed the burial of the remains of the former dictator in the graves that were in the cemetery that is supposed only to be used by national heroes. Young people actually came out, people who were not yet born during martial and opposed that. So in a sense, now there seem to be a coming together of older activists and younger activists, and now aided with social media, it's not a very smooth relationship. There are a lot of debates, even now with the campaign that supports the vice president as candidate for president. There are a lot of gatekeeping and debates about what's the proper way of actually campaigning. Some are traditional, some are newer, more younger generation Z styles. But in a way, I think there is an acceptance now that there are younger people coming in, and they bring in both their quirks, but at the same time, new ideas to the movement. Hopefully, we will see reinvigoration of many of these progressive movements. But we do have a problem with the formal educational sector. It has been I think the progressive sector has failed to address this properly through the decades since EDSA. It is only now that we are looking at the books at the basic education and high school levels, and many of them are not actually discussing major democratic and civic responsibilities. They are not even teaching what happened during very poor history textbooks are being produced by the public educational system. Regarding the female representation, actually there are more women representatives at the lower house, the House of Representatives, particularly through the party list representation system. Risa Hontevero started out as a party list representative of Akbayan. She actually only succeeded winning in the Senate in her third attempt. So that was in 2016. And because the term of office of senator is 6 years, the Constitution allows for re-election. So she's now running for re-election. So in terms of progressives in the Senate, she is the first one. And of course, well, Senator Laila de Lima is now considered also a progressive, but she was not originally a member of any progressive group, but she's of course now, because of her imprisonment, she is seen as also one of the most prominent faces of the opposition against Duterte. But other progressive groups also have female representatives in the House. The more should I say, the National Democratic groups or the Makabayan Bloc has Gabriela. That's the largest feminist movement in the Philippines, and they usually get at least 1 or 2 seats in the House of Representatives. And there are actually fresher, younger faces in the House of Representatives. It's just so difficult to penetrate the Senate because you have to be elected nationally. So the top 12 will so normally it's a popularity contest. So that's why it's more difficult. And well, the progressive sector is hoping that Risa can still make it. She's in the top 14, but Laila de Lima is in the lower. She's still far from the top 12 based on surveys. But hopefully, we will have younger female candidates who will try in different national and local positions, and hopefully they will represent more sectors in the Philippines, not just the upper and middle classes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ella. Last one is Olle. You might also wrap up our discussion. All right.
Thank you. I think Debbie, as usual, brought up vital questions with regard, how shall we say, young generation and the importance. I think Indonesia has a long history of that testifies to the importance of the young activists. The young activists were the most dynamic groups in the independence movements, in the liberation struggle in the 40s. The young generation redirected what I prefer to call the reformist-oriented communist organizations in the early 1950s. Of course, the young generation was among those who regenerated strength in the democracy movement in Indonesia. In particular, those who, in the end of the mid and late 1980s, went beyond the NGO focus, trying to widen the democracy movement to bring in and relate to popular grievances in a much more systematic and organized way. There were all kinds of problems related to this, but the younger generation was the propelling force in doing that. They lost out in the very transition, in the interplay with, I shouldn't have used that word, in the communication with the political players, the big shots, who mediated between the students, the mass movements on the one hand, and the established opposition, if you call it like that, like Megawati and Gustur and the others. So there were political players mediating between them, and in that process, the younger generation unfortunately lost out. Of course, they also had their own problems in not forming efficient enough organizations and whatnot. We can discuss. I've tried to address the issue in my book, but again, the young generation was crucial. And I think, why is it that the young generation is so important? Well, it is because they have a fresher perspective. They are not down the trenches. They have not yet established so many vital interests of their own that they need to defend, and so on. And that makes them in a dynamic group in society. And as also there are links to the educational institutions, which, as Luki said earlier, retains some autonomy, including this university, retains some autonomy that turns into a public space that can be utilized. So even though there is common to say that some students were sort of perceiving themselves as a moral force, I think we can begin to forget about that, because it's now about utilizing the political space provided in these framework. And it shouldn't only be referred to as the universities. We have a big task of trying to sort of get out in the ordinary educational institutions. If we look back into the history of Indonesia, we know that the teachers were crucial in the progressive movements. And if you want to have a figure related to that, you could go down and study the proportion of people being killed during the massacres, and you will find that a very high proportion of these people who were repressed and killed were teachers. Now, but the younger generation these days also have their, I would say, very not special, their common interest in an increasing precarity in future employment and positions. In my own country, we have now a new generation coming up, which will be the first generation for which it is apparent that they will not get a better standard of living than their parents. So that's the way the level of inequality has increased. That's the way the neoliberalism has affected us. But in your case, it's primarily, I think, the growing inequality, precarity in employment relations that is so crucial. And also but also the opening up of educational opportunities for wider section of the population. It's not just the sons and daughters of the elite that is going to the universities anymore. And these people, our friends, need to be, their challenges and problems must be addressed. So that's really an important factor. And of course, if I now may refer again to the experiences in Kerala, which Luki referred to, the original library movement in Kerala turning into wide-scale popular educational movements, people's science movements, and so on, have been the dynamic factor in further developing the process of change and democratic change in Kerala. So there is, and they were very much rooted in educational institutions. Most of the people who propelled the democratic decentralization in Kerala, combining this with further participation and with development ideas, were teachers, not just professors and that sort of thing, or lecturers or whatever. They were teachers in the villages, with a presence on the ground, and their senior pupils and students enrolled in this. There is also now the efforts in Kerala to build a knowledge-based development model, or development, the growth model, which relates very much to the ambitions and hopes, but also capacity of the younger educated population. So I do feel that this is an enormous potential. Sorry, I'm not, the benefit of not fasting. However frustrating it may be that certain old chaps like myself may be dominating here and there, and the need to discipline us, there is also this potential of the young generation to participate. If we now want a model for that, we don't need only to go to Kerala or to the movement built up in support of the Leni Robredo in the Philippines in the current campaign, but we should also read and listen and learn from what has happened in Chile, in Latin America, where the students, we have now a 35-year-old president in Chile. And he came out of the student movement, a student movement that related to wider problems than the students' own problems, specific problems. But it started with the equal access to educational possibilities. And then it was widened to others, in the people with in the informal employment and so on and so forth. And they won the election in the end, right? And they are changing the constitution. So to end on a positive note, I would say, and I agree with Luki, who says that, you know, the main, I think the implication of what you're saying, the main problem in Indonesia is not that democracy is regressing. It is regressing, but that is not the main problem. The problem is that we haven't built up strong enough forces to build up an alternative, an opposition to that. There is space still to do that. So I think we haven't, ideally, we've come up with these proposals you are talking about, and we can then challenge the rather elitist actors to relate to those proposals, and also the new political initiatives to relate to those proposals, so that these actors are not gaining the initiative in the election. So they are not monopolizing the election, but that they have to take a stand on formulated alternatives. That would be my dream. Thank you.
Thank you, Olle. I knew I said we had last question, but can we make an, because just now pop up a question from Bang Masda. He's from Medan. Horas Bang, apa kabar? So Masda from Medan, from
Terima kasih Kak Ayu.
A long friend of mine. So he has a question here for Professor Olle. How can human rights and rule of law in Indonesia for now strengthen the efforts to I need to enlarge this, the efforts to find the formula, new formula to defend to strengthen the democracy in Indonesia, because in the last part of your book you mentioned that you criticize basically the activists, the pro-democracy activists and human rights activists. What notes can you give for this regards?
Now I will end up by being unpopular by criticizing people. I think many of our good friends and close friends in the human rights movement and among those who fight against corruption and so on, and the rule law and all that, have had some problems of linking their very important issues, their very important struggle to the broader socioeconomic demands and conflicts in society. I think that if I may take one example, much of the anti-corruption work in Indonesia has focused on the big corruptors, the big fishes, and that is of course necessary, and it's also focused on a lot of leading politicians, which of course it's brilliant, it's fine, but less attention has been made to the corruption which relates to public services, to the kind of economic activities and public services which directly affects ordinary people. If you go out and ask ordinary people in India or in Indonesia or elsewhere, they know, of course, that the big fishes are corrupt, and mind, getting rid of them and to challenge them, but it doesn't necessarily relate to their immediate interest, because they are cynical enough, or not cynical, they are knowledgeable enough to know that if you get rid of one top guy, there will be another one. So they are more interested in the broader issues related to corruption. Now, one example of how that worked was the quick advance of a party called Common Man's Party. I don't know why there were some men there also, but Ordinary People's Party, they should have called themselves. It's short for RRP, UP. And they were running in the local election in New Delhi. And they grow out of an anti-corruption movement, but they address the ordinary problems of corruption in Delhi in the local field, in the local areas, and they rose up and they managed to win elections, a series of elections. Then they have had numerous problems which relates to their own internal democracy process and so on and so forth. But it proves the possibility of combining these issues of anti-corruption to those broader issues. I think the same applied to human rights. Of course, when Munir, that was Munir's critique of the old sort of framework for legal aid, that the legal aid, the human rights would be link up and contribute to the organization of those who were affected by the clampdown on people, and subject to the human rights campaigns. Now that is followed up now, but when all demands for human rights and critique of the imperfections in politics and democratization, when top priority is given to that without linking it properly to alternatives with regard to welfare reforms, social economic reforms in the labor sector, women's demands, and so on and so forth, then it turns, I'm afraid to say, a little bit limited, and we won't get the numbers. We aren't going to be an alternative in elections, which are necessary also to be. So that, yeah. So that link is so crucial to establish. Sorry, I shouldn't talk now more. I would like to make find a little thing. I hope you keep a good library in your university, and I would like to contribute to it with a copy of my book.
Thank you so much. Oh, wow. Yes, certainly we will keep this in our library. We have two libraries. One is the central one and one is in the faculty, but I think it's more useful. Oh, really? I was thinking maybe the central library so that many people can access this, but
They can come to you. You are going to follow up on the book. I
yes.
know that.
Well, all right, thank you so much. Okay, so we've come to the end of our meeting. Bang Masda, okay ya, Bang?
Ya, oke. Saya kira tepat itu.
Selamat dapat bukunya Kak Ayu.
Ya.
Orang ini buku buat universitas, maunya sih buat saya. So, Bang Masda is from Unimed Medan. Alright, nanti Unimed bisa minta atau bisa beli langsung bukunya. Alright. Alright, so I don't think, I mean, we've discussed quite intense and deep topics for today, and I don't think I'm a good person to try to wrap up in a nice way. But what I can take note from my note, we've discussed this book. I think opened our eyes and widen our understandings of what's happening nowadays in our world. Prof. Olle mentioned how crisis is not in particular countries or places, but it's a global one in North and South as well. And he goes through some historical overview and which way that we've been going now until at this point, and from the even for the Philippines and Indonesia, the pathway that we've gone through after the anti-colonial movement, and with all the ups and downs of the social democracy and its ways, with the crisis that is currently undergoing, there are also new hopes and openings, especially openings in the South, where we can see, and I'm very pleased that we spend a lot of times in this discussion to discuss these openings. Well, we found challenges as well, of course, but there are some opportunities or potentials also to take the advantage of the situations in the Philippines now with the upcoming election. When will be the election, Ella?
May 9.
May.
So less than a month from now.
Yeah, less than a month now. Yeah, well, good luck with that. But I hope what you say was it comes true that it's also a window, an opportunity for change. And if earlier Ole mentioned about transformative reform, that could be the agenda also for the Filipinos for the next upcoming election.
But the son of the dictator has to be defeated.
So you have the common enemy, no, right? Well, good luck with that.
Thank you.
Also, we talked about how there are some small rooms for us to maneuver to influence change. And again, I'm actually very attracted with the term transformative reform. I myself has been doing now this. My area is transitional justice, and recently I've been developing also more theoretical framework for transformative justice. And now I found encounter with this transformative reform. So it clicked in a way. Yeah, there are some small rooms in the national level. Luki was mentioning also even in the village level, in our community levels, and also some space that we can also do a lot contribution for these reforms in campus, for example, by having the campus movements or campus initiatives. There's some rooms there for better education. we talked also about the gender equality, and women should have more space to lead, right, Ella? I would agree with that. We have a good news, Ella, here in Indonesia. Just yesterday, we passed, after 4 years, we passed the legislation on a bill on the anti-sexual harassment, anti-sexual violence in Indonesia. It was a huge debate, and it's been postponed for long years. So we were very happy, and part of it also the women's movement efforts for that. Also, we Mbak Debbie remind us about the gaps on the generations, young generations roles, and we've also touched on, it is the young generations that often take significant roles for change, and of course we need to address this and to have a collaborations or join a hand together to try to build an alternative, in Ole's term, an alternatives and oppositions, because I think one of the problem here is, and the big problem is, that we cannot come up with an alternative, strong alternative for opposition. So I think, perhaps, excuse me, Ella, I need also to wrap it up in Bahasa Indonesia, if you don't mind, and Ole, just to wrap it up so the students can also follow. Jadi kurang lebihnya tadi beberapa yang kita sudah diskusikan selama 2 jam ini, lebih dari 2 jam, adalah tadi kita mulai dengan paparan dari Prof. Olle dari buku ini. Saya pikir ini buku yang luar biasa ya, buku dari hasil kerja bertahun-tahun, puluhan tahun oleh Prof. Tornquist. Ini buku trilogi yang ketiga, tapi juga yang menurut saya masterpiece juga dari Prof. Olle. Intinya juga dari buku itu tadi disampaikan oleh Olle bahwa hari ini kita mengalami krisis dari ekspansi neoliberalisme yang begitu masif, dan ini tidak hanya di beberapa negara, tapi ini terjadi di global. Eksesnya atau dampaknya banyak ya, tapi di antara banyak dampak itu tentu saja yang paling berdampak adalah kualitas demokrasi itu sendiri, tapi juga dari dampak itu, dari tantangan-tantangan yang ada, kita bisa menemukan juga beberapa harapan-harapan dan ruang-ruang untuk perubahan. Yang diusulkan Olle adalah sebuah perubahan yang reformasi yang sifatnya transformatif atau transformative reform, dan ini membutuhkan satu kekuatan alternatif, oposisi alternatif ya, yang selama ini sepertinya luput. Jadi masing-masing dari kita berupaya berjuang untuk demokrasi yang lebih baik, tapi kita lupa bahwa demokrasi membutuhkan sebuah oposisi yang solid, yang baik. Jadi ini menjadi sebuah alternatif. Tadi kita juga banyak menghabiskan waktu berdiskusi untuk membahas, dan saya senang sekali karena kita membahas ruang-ruang apa saja yang ada, yang mungkin bisa kita pengaruhi untuk membuat perubahan yang tadi sudah dibicarakan. Jadi in search of social democracy bisa di mana saja di sekitar kita ya. Kita harus cukup aware, termasuk juga bagaimana kampus sebetulnya punya peran strategis, dan mahasiswa tentu punya peran strategis untuk mengolah atau mengelola itu untuk membangun oposisi yang alternatif, oposisi tadi. Ada tadi soal, kita juga menyentuh soal gender equality, kesetaraan gender, dan bagaimana perempuan juga harus lebih banyak berperan ya di ruang publik. Tadi contoh dari Filipina ada, tapi juga saya pikir ada banyak contoh di Indonesia juga yang penting untuk kita catat tentang bagaimana perempuan itu dibutuhkan. Kalau kita bicara soal demokrasi, tidak mungkin demokrasi bisa maju kalau perempuannya juga tidak tampil di ruang-ruang publik. Yang terakhir tadi kita membahas soal ada gap atau kesenjangan generasi antara mungkin generasinya Pak Luki dan generasi teman-teman yang lebih muda, atau generasinya Olle ke generasi Pak Luki, ke generasi teman-teman yang lebih muda seperti saya gitu. Tapi sepertinya memang itu jadi isu besar ya yang harus kita pikirkan sama-sama. Intinya adalah bagaimana ini nanti bisa berkontribusi pada itu tadi alternatif, semangat alternatif yang membangun oposisi yang solid, yang kuat dan selama ini absen dalam demokrasi kita. Saya pikir itu yang bisa saya conclude, bisa saya simpulkan untuk pertemuan kali ini. So I thank you again for our speakers here, Prof. Olle Tornquist, and also Ella for joining with us and share your thoughts and opinions. Thank you all the audience here in the room, but also in Zoom meeting. I hope to see you all again in our events, and we would love to involve and invite again Tornquist, but also Ella to join us again. And thank you so much for everyone, and stay healthy, everyone. Stay safe. I will give back to the MC, Master of Ceremony.
Well, thank you to Mrs. Room as the moderator who has guided today's sharing session. I'm Andika Heri Susanto as the MC for today's. I apologize if there are words or action that are not pleasing. To all attendees, after the event ended, please don't leave the room first because we will doing a photo session. Okay, stay safe, stay healthy, and salam bela negara. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Ella.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.